Hi there, welcome to Pressure Point. I'm your host, Barbara Anderson. Tonight my special guest is Brian Teixeira, Outreach Educator for the BC Conference of the United Church. Welcome to Pressure Point, Brian.
Hello, Barbara.
You actually wear a couple of hats. You're not only Outreach Educator, but you're also the Ethnic and Multicultural Minister for the BC Conference.
Yes.
Anything else? New church development?
Church development, yeah.
Church or new church?
Well, just in general, so both new as well as redesigning existing ministries.
Have they changed the title of your job yet, or is it? You
I
still have all those three titles?
I don't worry too much about the title.
Well, welcome to Pressure Point anyway. Our program tonight is called Total Revolution, and I'm sure our viewers, when they saw that, said, I don't want any revolution, let alone total revolution. What is this about? Maybe you could start off by just telling us, what is total revolution? Where did the term come from?
It comes out of my experience in India. I was in India for a study leave over 87, 88, and was very interested in what's happened with the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi, the whole nonviolence movement in India. And the total revolution movement is where that movement has got to in late 1980s. And it comes out of a sense that what Gandhi meant by nonviolence involved such a shift, not only in, it wasn't just a matter of getting rid of the British, but it was probably what Mao Zedong might call a cultural revolution as well. So it involved not just the political, but the economic, the educational, family relationships, personal relationships. So that if India was going to follow in Gandhi's footsteps, what would be involved was a total, or if you want, a total cultural revolution. And so there were two major followers that came after Gandhi that sort of kept his thought going, and one of them especially coined that idea.
Well, now, you're talking about nonviolence then, the nonviolent path that Gandhi began in India. Some of our viewers might be saying, well, I'm nonviolent, I don't hurt any people, I don't kill anyone. What do you mean by nonviolence? What, I mean, is that as simple as it sounds?
No, I don't think so. For Gandhi, it wasn't, and I guess I should say that the idea of nonviolence existed before Gandhi. It's existed by people who have no influence from Gandhi. So it seems to be very much part of our own human struggle as we look for justice, that there have always been people that have come up with this idea as a way of going at justice. Now, with Gandhi, he was assuming that it was first of all a spiritual experience, that an individual would come to a new understanding of who we all were, whether it was your enemy or your opponent or your friend, that we're all one. It comes very much out of a Hindu idea of we're all one, we're all Brahman, although Gandhi was able to put it into a lot of Christian terms because he was also influenced by Christians. But the other part of that, which would say like simply not doing violence to another person, is not enough, because Gandhi was talking about a certain spiritual understanding of who we all are. He was also saying that if you were really working for nonviolence, you would always start with the least. That if you could identify who were the least, who were the most marginalized in society, the ones who didn't have a good political voice, or who religious traditions said were non-persons, or who economically were poor, so the sort of very marginalized in our society, you had to go and be and work for justice for them, because if that could be achieved, the whole society would have to be transformed. So with nonviolence came a certain strategy for social change that said you didn't work with large bureaucratic structures, that you moved to the margin of the society and you tried to deal with that. And if you could do that, then you would have to achieve total revolution in the process. So that was all. When he talked nonviolence, he wasn't just talking let's be nice to each other and let's not hit each other. He was talking about a spiritual vision and a very definite way of reversing how we've organized our societies, or at least changing how we've organized our societies.
But that, some of our viewers will think right away, well, that's quite a bit like what Jesus was talking about.
Exactly, yes.
The least among you will be the first.
I think what Gandhi did, and people like Martin Luther King were able to recognize, Martin Luther King being probably our most popular, well-known, recent follower, although somebody like Cesar Chavez with the grape and lettuce boycott also follows Gandhi. But Martin Luther King, until he read Gandhi, just saw the kind of Christian gospel as a way of loving your neighbor, loving your friend. And then on the other side there was social injustice, and he couldn't make the connection. And it was in reading Gandhi that he began to see how the gospel could be sort of turned into a political strategy as well. And so from Gandhi he learned how to, realize or actualize the gospel message in political terms. So, and I think that's what Gandhi, in a sense, brings to Christians as well. We've got our understanding of love and of going after the most needy and the poor and so forth, but the kind of radicalness with which Gandhi put that into a political agenda, I think, has attracted many Christians.
And so they're trying to see how they can, in fact, turn the world upside down.
Yes.
The way Jesus did,
Yes.
and the way Gandhi tried to do in his society, and so on.
Certainly the image of Jesus, the suffering servant, all those other metaphors that we know of as Christians were very dear to Gandhi. He just saw no reason to become a Christian. I guess the more I've understood Hinduism, it doesn't really matter. He follows after the truth, and where he finds it, he recognizes it as truth. So he was able to borrow many things from Christianity.
Now, when you talk about nonviolence, and very few people in history have really practiced nonviolence the way you describe it. I mean, we've talked about probably the three most famous: Jesus, Gandhi, Martin Luther King. All three of those met violent ends, died a
Yes.
violent death, although they did not do any violence to other people in their lives. What is the kind of irony about that?
Well, maybe a couple of things to say on that. That one is that I think those people were the most visible in recent times anyway. But I mean, it is probably arguable that maybe even greater than Gandhi's nonviolence was his wife's. But I mean, she's not as popular, but in terms of having the kind of integrity of life that Gandhi was talking about. So I guess I'm saying there are other peoples maybe than those three that did practice it. They just sort of got into the limelight a lot more. But in terms of the attracting of violence, I think part of nonviolence is bringing people to be conscious of the violence within a situation. And often that means yourself going into violence and receiving the violence of that situation as a way of making it visible. That is one strategy used within the nonviolence tradition. So the possibility of drawing latent violence to such an extent that you could be killed at some point is always there. I've talked with some of the people in India about that, and strategically could be a disaster in one way. Somebody leading a movement, for instance, and drawing that kind of violence in order to bring it into the light, and then being killed early within a movement could really decimate a movement. But that seems to be one of the risks of nonviolent organizing. And anybody being involved in it needs to be conscious that they will draw violence, and they need to know what to do when it arises.
Are they drawing violence from the system that they are opposing, or are they drawing violence because some people believe that all men and women are inherently violent people?
Well, both of the above. I think the goal would be to draw to make visible the violence that is there in the system. Now, that could be done in many ways. We're talking about the most dramatic way right now. I mean, it could be done by doing popular education or popular theater in the streets so that people could see. It could be done by picketing. I mean, there are many ways of manifesting the violence and the dehumanization within a society.
So practicing nonviolence is not just simply sitting there passively saying, well, I'm being nonviolent. It's an active way of being in the world.
I think you have to really distinguish between nonviolence and pacifism. Nonviolence is not pacifism.
Okay, can you explain the difference?
Well, the pacifism approach would say there's an enemy coming at me, and if the enemy wants to run over me, I'll just be here. And that is not what nonviolence is about. Nonviolence is about confronting evil in the world, but doing so without violence. So the nonviolent person would involve in all the usual mechanisms we know of social change, all the way from lobbying to picketing to theater to doing dramatic acts in public, various ways that you could educate the public, maybe even educate the opponent, sometimes even trying to educate the people that are being oppressed so that they understand the violence that they're. So there's all sorts of ways of doing that. Now that can escalate, and usually when most people talk about nonviolence, they're talking about that very escalated form when somebody might come at them with a stick or a gun or whatever. And that's why where I started by saying that nonviolence is first of all a spiritual understanding, and then having some strategy of how you live that spirituality out. And then really there's a whole range of possible actions that you can take. But it is an active form of resistance to evil or non-cooperation with evil. And it's not pacifism. Like Gandhi did not accept, he started out being attracted by pacifist models and models of what were also called civil disobedience. But as he went on in his life, he refused to use those words because he saw them as too passive or too negative. And so he talked about nonviolence and talked about truth force, the force of knowing you're moving with the truth or the spirit within a situation.
So there have been pacifist movements. There still are pacifist
Yes.
sects or denominations in the Christian church.
There are peace churches within Christianity, for instance, Mennonites, the Hutterites, Quakers. So within Christianity, there are peace traditions. Now, within those peace traditions, though, you'll get a range from pacifist to more nonviolent, active nonviolent traditions. I think the tendency would be more to the active nonviolence rather than to the sort of passive resistance way.
Because we always think, when we think of pacifism, I suppose, and even nonviolence, probably incorrectly according to you, we think of the famous line that Jesus said, if someone strikes you, turn the other cheek. Is that nonviolence or is that pacifism?
I'm not sure what exactly Jesus was meaning by that. Certainly that phrase was taken, but you also have Jesus confronting many different other situations as well. I'm not biblical exegesis is not my forte, but there are many situations where Jesus does confront evil up to a certain point, where he gets crucified at the end of it. But he's not passive. He chose to go into Jerusalem and confront both the hierarchy of the state and of his religion of the day. So he didn't just he took them on.
He didn't just wait for them to come to him necessarily, but he went into the city. He confronted
the evil. He did it. He tried to do it from a place of non-hatred, and but it was not a pacifist position.
Now, we're talking about justice and confronting forms of evil, systemic injustice, if you will.
Yes.
I'm thinking of some of the countries, for instance, South Africa, India, where Gandhi obviously lived a great deal of his life and was very popular. There's still a lot of strife there and injustice. South Africa, injustice. Thinking of Northern Ireland, where there are two Christian groups fighting each other, who obviously both purport to follow Jesus, the one who preached nonviolence. And these are just three areas of the world in which there is a lot of injustice happening. Can one, in fact, achieve justice through nonviolence? I mean, can justice come about without violence?
Can justice come about by violence?
Well, can it come about, yes.
By violence. Well, I mean, the same question can be asked.
Some people say without, okay.
The same question can be asked the other way. I mean, can justice come about by violence? I mean, sometimes in asking the question, there's the assumption that it can't, but that it can come about by violence. I mean, there are pros and cons either way. I think the nonviolent way often hasn't been tried before it has been dumped. There's no way that within a certain context I could say, well, sort of fault anyone or guilt anybody out for not being nonviolent. I mean, they have to choose within their own situation what to do. On the other hand, often nonviolence is not tried, and because there's some assumption that nonviolence will not bring about justice. But anybody who argues that also has to prove to me that violence will bring about justice. That is not proved either.
I suppose
it will bring about maybe a change of government.
Yes.
But will that bring about justice? That's still not...
and I suppose then one has to define the word justice.
Right.
Justice for whom?
Yes.
We have people in the States, for instance, who look upon the American Revolution as a triumph of justice, a triumph of good over injustice. Or, and there are other revolutions. The French Revolution is looked upon in our history and so on.
It seems to me it's got to be in some sort of process. I mean, even if violence is used to bring about a change, the goal still has to be some sort of basically non-violent goal that we're working towards. I mean, nobody wants to have a society that's predicated on violence.
Is that what's wrong with American society today?
I'm not sure what's wrong with American society. I'm sure it's just not one thing.
But what you're saying seems to point to some of that if it's built on violence,
well, that would be...
it might lead to a violent society.
Well, that is one of the arguments, that what you achieve by violence, you can only maintain by violence. That's one of the difficulties with violent revolution. Non-violent revolution, maybe one of the biggest difficulties with it is it assumes a huge mass base of participation, which isn't often there, or when the mass base is there, and I think India is a good example, it was quite opportunistic, that they were there to get rid of the British, but they weren't really there to bring about a nonviolent society. Gandhi in himself was deluded by that, and in the last 2 years of his life was able to admit that. So the extent of organizing that is really needed to pull off a nonviolent revolution, or large-scale social change anyway, is massive compared to what would be involved in just having an army go in and take over the communication system and beat up the other army that was there before.
It's much easier if you have a gun at someone's head to say, look, do it my way for now.
Right, but is that any more justice? I mean, you've changed some things, but the process of bringing about justice is still long beyond any kind of violent revolutionary process.
Let's talk about South Africa for a minute. There have been, furors in the Christian Church, in the World Council of Churches, for instance, in the program to combat racism, which was accused of supplying some kind of military aid to groups practicing violence. And yet, on the other side of the coin, people have said, during the Second World War, Christians in the Western Hemisphere and in the Northern Hemisphere found it quite easy to call up God's name and head off into a war and killing and so on. And yet now we turn upon people in South Africa and say, you have to achieve justice through nonviolent means. Is that fair? I mean, what's happening there? Is it fair to expect that of another group of people, another group of Christians, when we didn't really expect that of ourselves?
First of all, maybe I would say that the non-violence in South Africa, as I understand it, is originating from some South Africans. I don't think all. I don't think even all of the Christian leadership in South Africa. Some of the more well-known South African leadership, Christian South African leadership, Bishop Tutu being a primary one, are proposing a non-violent route. So the non-violence, I don't think some Westerner is saying to South Africans, you have to do it in a non-violent way. I think that's a debate they themselves are engaged in. I think Christians maybe on the outside of it, sometimes where we could get involved in it is that we can be very pure about the whole thing because it's at such a distance, and we could really I know Christians would probably opt for either side, really. They would opt for the violence or opt for the non-violence, but they don't pay the cost. The ones who would opt for non-violence, and obviously I have a bias that way, often are not aware of the price, for instance, that sanctions or other kinds of non-violent involvement in South Africa mean for people. Similarly, the ones who would propose violence. So I think over here, in general, around the issue of non-violence, most of us are not aware of the price of what it takes, and probably are equally unaware when we support liberation movements, Christian liberation movements anyway, that include violence, often we're not aware of the costs of that. We're very, especially in Canada, I mean, what kind of revolution has Canada ever experienced? Even the United States has an understanding of that. Maybe some of the Canadian people that have fought in wars have a sense of the price of violence versus nonviolence. For many of us, it's a very luxurious life we've lived, especially in Canada, even more than the States.
So we don't realize the cost that we're asking other people to bear.
Yeah, whether we're opting for violence or nonviolence, I think often we're ignorant of the cost. Because I think both options assume some blood will be shed. I don't think it's realistic in most of the world's conflicts to assume, even if you opt for nonviolence, that some people will not, if not die, be seriously hurt or be seriously damaged in their lifestyles or their,
and suffer some consequences
Yes.
to the actions that you take and that others take in reaction to that.
So,
Is nonviolence do you see nonviolence as really the only Christian path to follow? And if one takes the route of saying, I am going to follow Jesus Christ, does that following Jesus Christ lead inevitably down the path of nonviolence? Do you see that as the way that leads?
If we could fiddle a bit with the word
Okay.
only, I think that for me there is a sort of ideal with opting for a nonviolent path. On the other hand, I don't think that ideals can be imposed, otherwise they become rules or oppressive things. I don't think they can be imposed on any individual or on any society. So while I think nonviolence would still be the goal we opt for, and I would think even people who, and many of the people that I've talked to, that say we know all we've got left is the gun, and I have talked with people like that here and in other parts of the world, would still say if I had any other way, if I could really believe it was possible to do it nonviolently, I would do it nonviolently. So I don't think there's anybody, even the most not pathologically violent people, but people who are working for social change and that opt for nonviolence, even those people, if they could have it, would rather it be nonviolent. So out of that basis, I'm still saying that there is a certain ideal for all of us that even might be held to by people who choose violence, but because of their context, because of their own personal limitations, the limitations of their situation, might say, but this is practically all I feel able, or all we feel able to do right now.
How does one make that conversion to nonviolence?
Slowly. Even for me, it's a progressive thing. I mean, years ago I would not have been as strong as I am now about it, and I still have some questions. But it has been a progressive thing for me. So I don't think, I think the bend that I went around was when I asked you the question, but will violence get us justice? I think that's the bend that then sort of something flips over at that point. I mean, yes, I'm impatient, and yes, I want something to change right now, so okay, let's get out the guns. But does that really get us any closer to violence? I mean, to justice, So that question started a whole series of questions for me that had me revalue or reevaluate the nonviolent tradition.
So it's through that kind of persuasion, even if it's self-persuasion, or hearing other people's arguments, seeing other people's lives, and perhaps through one's own experience, having lived out a life. As you say, some people who've lived through wars may come to the conclusion that that is not the way to go.
And that also, I mean, the bulk of social justice is not in the fighting and in the revolution. It's in the building the little healthcare unit, or teaching literacy so that people can exercise their franchise politically or get involved in whatever it is, because they can speak their mind now and they can read it. And so that nonviolence as a way of being in political change involves all those things too, so that the project of social transformation or total revolution is not just about a battle and then getting it over. And nonviolence, I think, is more involved with that long haul social change dynamic.
So, given the long haul that one has to go through, one could easily, if one is impatient, come to the conclusion that there's no end to this, that there's always another mouth to feed, there's always someone else to educate, there's always another program that can be started to get people on that road towards justice, towards equality, and so on. Where do you see signs of hope in that struggle?
I guess in small things and in some large. I mean, one sign of hope is what's happened for black people in especially the United States. Now, we live in a world where there's no way of not having your hands dirty. So if you're looking for signs of hope that don't have a dirty side to them, you're not going to find them.
So in other words, if you find a situation that's been rectified, don't bet that it wasn't rectified perhaps with some means of violence somewhere down there.
Well, that, but also even in a rectified situation, it's got its own problems. You know, that every solution has problems in it. There's no, I mean, every Nobel Peace Prize, or rather a scientific prize, really is somebody else's problem. So
let's not forget that Nobel got his money from making gunpowder.
Right, of course.
Yeah. Okay, so.
But that sense of, like, I think when people ask for signs of hope, they want signs of hope that have no dirty hands with it, no problem edges with it. And so they want something, you know, if there's a success, it has to be a pure success. Well, pure anything does not exist in this world. So even where there's, once you can grant, I guess, that even in the best signs of hope, there are going to be parts of it that are pretty embarrassing, productive of some amount of oppression, and so forth, then I think you can identify things like what's happened for black people in the United States. In India, I mean, you could say, well, they got rid of the British, and then somebody can immediately bring up all the problems that has created.
Yeah.
But in a sense, that was a move for many of those people. So I think that's the problem with looking for signs of hope. I think I can find many of them, but I can't find any of them that are sort of absolute. And I don't have the sense of, like, we're going to work one day and create the kingdom on earth. I think that's a bit of a myth too. So there's always a dynamic, and every solution has its own problems built in, and you keep working. So there's no heaven on earth that we create.
We have to keep working at it.
Yes.
Well, thanks very much, Brian, for being with us. It's been really helpful just talking about this, and maybe we can go out from this and continue on in the struggle to keep working at it non-violently.
Oh, good.
Working for total revolution. Thanks, Brian, for being with us.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara.
And thank you for joining us on The Pressure Point. Good evening, and God bless.